It's my pleasure to open our seminar today. We have with us David Garcia, and we are very excited to hear from him today. So, David, would you like to introduce yourself?
Oh, yes, of course.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Hi. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for staying indoors with me in such a nice day. I know it could be nicer outside, but thanks for waiting with me. Yeah, well, my name is David Garcia. I'm new in Konstanz. I joined the political science department last October. I'm professor for social and behavioral data science, which means that I'm a bit of an infiltrated person in political science. I'm a computer scientist by background, and I'm trying to help political scientists to measure things they don't know how to measure with traditional methods. And I'm here, and I'm also at the Complexity Science Hub in Vienna. That is where I spent my last 5 years, and I still have part of my group in Vienna and in Graz. So there we deal especially with collective behavior. So that's also something that links me to your work. But we'll talk more about that. Just a comment. If you want, my slides are online that you can check real time, but also I put a link on Twitter in reply to the link about this talk. So if you want, you can also find it there. So just introducing also my team. Everything I will present today has been collaborations with some subset of people here. Some of them are in Konstanz, some of them are in Graz, because I still have some grants there, and some are also in Vienna. So we don't know how to call ourselves anymore because we're in so different places and meet mainly through Zoom. But everybody in this slide is linked to me, at least because I'm a PI of one of their grants or their PhD supervisor. And they are extremely interdisciplinary. Myself, I'm a computer scientist, like Petar, for example, or Emma, and Segun, who is here in Graz. Here in Konstanz, you see. But there's other people, like Jana Lasser, for example, is a physicist. Hannah Metzler is a psychologist. Alina is also a psychologist. Anna Di Natale is a mathematician. So we are all a mix between the STEM or more quantitative sciences and psychology and communication science or also other social sciences. So I'm trying to not do things just in one discipline, but actually trying to bring people together from different disciplines. Sometimes you can try with like a big grant with different labs, but that's not as good as having people of different disciplines in the same lab, in the sense that we really collaborate with each other and try to have different methods and perspectives from different backgrounds. Everything I will present is also funded by the Vienna Science and Technology Fund that very graciously started my career when I was in Vienna, and by the ERC on a collaboration I have with colleagues at Bristol and Potsdam. So yeah, everything I will present is thanks to those funders. So what do we do? Just a bit introduction also before I go into the science. We try to do social data science as an interdisciplinary approach to study human behavior from new data. And often when people talk about things like social data science or computational social science or some new kind of disciplinary buzzword, they have a Venn diagram like this, where there's like computer science, math and statistics, and some sort of domain knowledge, in this case social sciences. And then whoever is in the middle is that magical unicorn that is able to mix all of those disciplines and somehow knows everything and can do everything wonderfully better than anybody else in their disciplines. And I've seen like 40 versions of this diagram, and I never really knew how to do it from this description alone. In particular, how to move from the traditional approach of statistics as trying to make sound inferences from too little data to the aim of data science that is a bit different, which is making meaningful inferences from too much data. And these two things pose different problems in the sense that data scarcity might not be a problem, but other things like representation or measurement validity can be stronger problems in the era of data science. So just as a general comment, I remember when I was in my PhD and I said, I want to do data science, and a senior member around the commission said something like, that's just statistics for millennials. And I agree. We have new data, we have new problems, maybe because we're a different generation, but the world is a bit different than 50 years ago, where you had too little data. So we also need to think how to do things right and not just the same way as they were done before. So my personal recipe, how to mix these, is kind of outlined here. So first, as a computer scientist, the pink part is that I measure what people do online, basically on digital traces. Most of the time is social media, but other times is from, for example, mobile phone apps or other kinds of technologies that leave a trace of what people do. And most of the time we process that with some computational methods, but what we measure, we don't know very well what it is. We can assume what it is, but we need some validations. In particular, I validate those metrics versus surveys that we know that they have some limitations, but at least we should expect some sort of agreement between methodologies. And what I will present today is actually part of that, of how can we validate kind of computational or social data science methodology against some other methods that we understand better from the social sciences. And then once we have something we can measure and that we know what we measure, then making sense of it is pretty hard, because this is behavior of people in the real world, I mean the real digital world. They interact with each other, they can behave like a whole crowd, or they can display also collective behavior. So making sense of it requires more than just the typical hypothesis testing of X causes Y. And for that we work on computational modeling, mainly agent-based modeling, to explain that kind of natural behavior from principles of individual dynamics that then we test in experiments. So the example I will show today is something on emotions. In particular, I have worked, like my whole PhD thesis was on computational modeling of collective emotions. But I will focus mainly on the first part, on how we validate measurements, because it's where the most exciting research I've done in the last couple of years. But just if you want to learn more about my modeling work, more on computational representations of collective behavior, you can check my papers, because I've worked a lot on that. So where we apply this, today I will talk about affective science, so understanding human emotions, in particular towards collective emotions. But especially that modeling part, we applied also to understand polarization, in particular polarization in many dimensions, or with network structures that affect who interacts with whom. And these other computational approaches, we're using them nowadays to study misinformation or informational disorders that are like more general problems, with misinformation being one, but manipulation could be another. And that's a topic that for a few years after Donald Trump won an election, I said, I don't want to research on that. But then grants started coming, and then I got convinced that this is an important problem. So there's again another side of my research that I cannot cover today, that specially studies on basically the disease behind the existence of misinformation. And finally, another topic I cannot really touch much today is what they call complex privacy, which is how you can use the network nature of social media data to make inferences on people who don't share information, sometimes people who are not even in a platform. And this idea of actually thinking about a network rather than individuals making decisions is helpful there. But again, today I will focus on the emotional part of my research, because I think it's a good illustration of collective behavior for you here today. So the outline of what I will present first is a study in which we linked collective emotions on social media data to a process of social resilience, of reacting to adverse events in society, which had a lot of assumptions on the methodologies on what we could measure from social media. And since then, we have been validating some of the more advanced methods, for example, how to make macroscopes of emotions in whole societies using social media data, how to test that against surveys, as I told you earlier. And now we're also working in trying to identify individual level emotions. So really this person is expressing that emotion in this particular piece of text, and trying to do that with as higher accuracy as possible. So first, the idea of collective emotions is far from new. In particular, Emil Durkheim, more than a century ago, talked about collective effervescence, as effervescence is kind of basically a word for emotionality, identifying, for example, when there's a ritual and people are sharing an emotional state, and that leads them to, for example, have some shared identity or shared beliefs. Actually, Emil Durkheim was identifying the existence of collective emotions or shared emotions as something that was sometimes paradoxical, sometimes unpleasant, but that explains that people are more connected to each other after that collective emotion. Like when you're in a football match and your team loses and you still support a horrible team that loses all the time, but that makes you feel part of something. So Emil Durkheim was saying that there's that function of the collectivity of the emotion despite the individual level emotion being a bit unnecessary. Since then, there's been a lot of work, especially in philosophy, on defining collective emotions. Back in 2014, there was a book that had a definition of collective emotions, saying that collective emotions are emotional states shared by a large amount of people at the same time. It's a very condensed definition, so it says, first of all, collective emotions are emotional states. They are not opinions or beliefs or other subjective states. They have to be basically encoded in some physiology, influencing behavior and communication. So in particular, when you say, you know what is an emotion, basically they have to be emotions. That they are shared by a large amount of people, so that to some extent there is some sort of contagion or some process that makes people have an emotion because others have an emotion. By a large amount of people, what is large is a bit complicated to define, but you know that it's not an individual or dyadic level behavior. It has to be collective, as you study here. And at the same time, meaning that it has to be synchronous to a certain extent. And if people are feeling emotions because they read a book, for example, it is large, it's a lot of people, but it's not collective because they don't feel it at the same time. And since then, there's been actually more work on defining the complexity of collective emotions. For example, complexity over time or over network structures. But the very, very basic definition is this one of a synchronous state of emotionality that people in a large group are sharing with each other. So collective emotions can look pretty different. Like that one, the example of the football goal is that you have an audience that is experiencing the same causation or cause of the emotion, that is a goal, and they might experience at the same time some sort of excitement because their team scored the goal. And that is an easy case of a collective emotion because you can trace when it starts, that is the goal of the team. And sometimes it can be harder, like the example of a riot is a situation in which there can be a wave of anger that spreads in a crowd, and there might not be a special point when the anger started. It's just a state that is emerging from the interaction of people, and a perfectly peaceful demonstration might become aggressive at any random point during the demonstration. So today I will talk more about the first part, collective emotions that start because of something, as the second part requires a much more complicated modeling to be able to tell what are the conditions for something to become emotional. But still we can understand a lot of things about collective emotions even if they have to start with a particular trigger or event that everybody can see. In particular in psychology, why these triggered collective emotions are interesting is because they are related to what is called collective traumas. And a collective trauma is a traumatic event that usually affects some people. They might die, they might lose a limb, they might lose family members in a society in a way that they cannot be predicted. For example, it could be a natural disaster, it could be a terrorist attack that might also be very hard to predict. And psychology has focused on understanding trauma very closely to the people who have been affected by the trauma, again, that have, for example, lost a family member. But this idea of collective emotions poses that the rest of the society will also react to that trauma, even if they have not been directly affected. And Durkheim's theory was predicting that there will be a process that if there is a collectively emotional reaction, the society will earn some resilience to prepare to future traumas. So in particular, the theory is not very precise. It's a 100-year-old sociology thing in French. It's really complicated to turn into testable hypotheses. But after reading it and comparing it with psychology literature, Bernard Rimet and me, also as he's a psychologist, we managed to draw a hypothesis that basically says that after the trauma, there's an emotional reaction of people that interact with each other and reactivate the emotions of each other that makes them have an emotional experience that lasts longer than if they had it in isolation. Basically, in isolation, they will forget about it the next day, but because they talk with each other, this lasts for a while. And because they have stayed together and experienced that emotion at the same time, they will show higher levels of prosociality or orientation towards doing things with other people for a period of time afterwards. So that's the key prediction from Durkheim's theory. And basically it says that there will be some people involved in the collective emotion and some people not. And the ones involved should be able to be willing basically to help others, or at least talk about helping others in the longer run. So we tested this a while ago. Actually, I set up already a system to start tracking emotions on social media, in particular on Twitter, back in 2012. I met Bernard Rimet in 2011 after the tsunami in Japan, and we decided to try to track a case of a strong collective emotion. And it took a while until we had our case, which was especially in November 2015, when there was the terrorist attacks in Paris. That was something that I had my measurement machine tuned for. And I got basically all the tweets that were posted from continental France before and after the terrorist attacks. And we could filter things like, of course, bots, media organizations, retweets, but we could have a very clean case of information that was coming from France, from people we could verify that lived in France, and that we could analyze how they behaved before, right after, and long after the terrorist attacks. So in the end, after cleaning, the final sample I have is about 60,000 users on Twitter that live in France. I could get everything, again, the history before and afterwards, so that we made a baseline period of 6 months before, well before the attacks happened. And here you see the timeline of the number of tweets on Twitter per day, with the red line being the attacks. And there was a jump, almost more than double the number of usual tweets during the evening of the attacks, and also in the next days. The location of users, you can see that approximately in the map. And here there's some word clouds that if you speak French, you can tell that before the attacks they were not talking about the attacks, and afterwards they were mentioning like pray for Paris, attentats, and so on. So this is just a kind of easy visualization to check that they are talking about the attacks, because sometimes with these pics you never know. There might be some other trend happening on social media, so it's good to check at least the text a little bit to see that it's about the attacks. So with this we could analyze what people were saying to test those hypotheses from Durkheim's theory. The first method we applied is a very simple one, because this study was basically almost a decade ago. Now we have worked on this, and I will show you how we do this nowadays, but just a simple reference. This method is called linguistic inquiry and word count, LUK for short, like Luke Skywalker. And it's a very simple method. It's just counting words on text, and the words belong to particular classes, for example, emotions. Among emotions, they have like anxiety, sadness, and anger. But there's also word lists that psychologists have generated for social processes or pro-social behavior, or people talking about French values and so on. So there's development by psychologists identifying words that they think identify these constructs or these types of behaviors. Of course, this is a super simple method. It's okay if you apply it to a lot of text and you know who is talking, and you can clean things that don't make sense. But again, I will show you later how we're doing this nowadays with more advanced text analysis models, because we want to make sure that from now on we take into account things like negation or exaggerations. So this is what we had back then. We validated it against annotations of French tweets, but again, this is a 10-year-old methodology, just for you to know how we were doing things back then. And once we had that, we could measure a timeline of affective expression. I mean, there's some statistics behind this, in the sense that, for example, there's a weekly oscillation of emotions, in the sense that we are much more positive during the weekend than on Mondays. But after removing all those regularities, we can measure that kind of deviation from the null of emotional expression in a whole country. And here you have the timelines right before and right after the terrorist attacks in France for positive and negative emotional terms, and then for the 3 negative classes that we know or that are validated for LUK. So first you see that the timelines are pretty null or pretty close to the 0 before the attacks, and then as soon as the attacks happened, the content of tweets changed, such that we had more negativity and less positivity. But the interesting thing is that on top of this, we can fit a time series model that tells us basically the memory until the time series goes back to the baseline, which is this parameter that we fit here. This is inspired on an agent-based model that tells us, based on the intensity of interaction between agents in emotions, what can we expect this coefficient to be. And if we have a collective emotion, we expect this coefficient to be significantly above 0. And that's what we find. Actually, we see that it takes, it's not super long, but it takes about 2 weeks for the emotion to go back to the neutral. And this can be explained by some low-level interaction between the emotions of people. Of course, this is different than in a situation where the people are not talking so much about an emotion, perhaps because it's not so strong. We have a counterexample of this in Vienna. There was a terrorist attack not that long ago, right before a lockdown, when not that many people died. And this picture looks very different. There's a spike and then goes back to the neutral basically 2 days later. So when I talk about the lifetime of a collective emotion, online the expectation is 2 days. And when I say 2 weeks, that means that is something basically pretty historical for social media. So first, you see that there's an increase of negativity as we expect, and not an increase of positivity, and that this is mainly because of expression of worry and anxiety for the attacks, and then to some extent sadness that comes later, and some degree of anger. But this is the fact that we check that there is a collective emotion. What we do later is that the theory is again linking this to terms that signal that social resilience. So for example, social process terms is people saying things about doing things with other people, like communities or friends. And you see here the spike happens the day after the attacks and takes much longer to go back to the baseline. Pro-social terms, that is about donating things or doing things that are altruistic. It also jumps and it even stays a bit above the baseline for quite a while after the attacks. And these are these French value terms that are just this égalité, liberté, and fraternité. That is just an example, but also it follows the same trend. It jumps and then it takes a while to go back to the baseline. So these are the components of the theory. We have the collective emotion and some sign of prosociality. Then we linked them by analyzing individuals, because not everybody was equally involved in that collective emotion. There were some people that were expressing more emotions than usual in their own language. So for the 2 weeks after the attack, if someone was more emotional than before, we said that they were in the high emotional synchronization scenario, in the sense that they were part of the collective emotion. And if they were equally emotional or less, we call them in the low emotional synchronization. They didn't really participate on this kind of online collective behavior. And then we can analyze how their other language differed before and after the attacks, based that they self-selected into those two groups. So here you have an example of a plot for many months before and after the attacks. So this time scale is much more than the other. In gray, there's these 2 weeks after the attacks where we separate users. And you see that before the attacks, they're basically indistinguishable in terms of social process terms, in terms of talking about other people. And after the attacks, they separate, and the users that were in the collective emotion are on average using those terms, the social terms, much more, or well, more, substantially more, something like between 10% of the baseline more for a few months, until 6 months later they basically go back to the same level. And there's a similar plot for the other indicators we have. We also tried by, for example, correcting who self-selects into the collective emotion for some confounders and so on. And we found quite a robust pattern. If you were more emotional during those 2 weeks after the attacks, for the next 5 to 6 months, you were also using more terms that were related to social resilience. So I saw it as one of the first tests of that theory that I always thought it was impossible to test, because you needed so much data on so many people over so long period of time. But at least I saw that the theory had some merit, that the people who are involved in a collective emotion show higher signs of prosociality, or at least language related to prosociality. So in a sense, it's not that crazy that collective emotions have a social purpose that contributes to social resilience. What we learned from this is that first, something like a terrorist attack can trigger a collective emotion that we can observe online, not necessarily, and that's what we learned later in Vienna. But we can track this with the language of people online. In this particular case, given that we had a lot of data, we could measure their positive and negative terms. And that again, some people were involved in the collective emotion, and those were showing this higher language of social orientation. But don't take this as a message that always collective emotions are good and they always help us. They can also exacerbate intergroup conflict. And people, especially researchers in Israel, have found many examples when this happens, and it can even be manipulated in an experiment. They can create short-term orientation, for example, of people thinking less about the long-term future and more about what to do now. So it's not necessarily that we say collective emotions are desirable. They just have a function, and whether that function is desirable or not requires more thinking about it. So I left there a link if you want to explore the results or check the paper from a few years ago. And this was a motivation for the methodological work we've been doing later to validate these kind of metrics. No? How can we analyze social media data to get something that makes sense to us? So first, we wanted to validate, this was a big question for me, how can we validate a time series like the one I showed you earlier in France? How can we tell that it's actually saying something about the emotions of the society of France and not just of a couple of weird people that happen to use Twitter? And this was the idea of social media macroscopes. So there's been quite some work in the last decade of using this kind of data to make statements about society as a whole. But there's a series of issues. First, who is represented in these traces is not the same as the rest of the population. So what we want to learn about everyone might not be very valid if we use this kind of data. Second, these are people who are talking to each other online. It's a particular type of communication, and what they will tell us, for example, in a survey or in private, could be very different. Third, we are applying methods like this kind of text analysis, and they can have, first of all, errors, like there's a measurement error that we need to account for in our analysis, but also a bias. For example, it might have more error for some groups of people than for others. And fourth, there's a lot of researcher degrees of freedom, in the sense that once we start making a list of what methods we can apply, especially for text analysis, there are so many that if we run them all and just cherry picked the one that gives us significant results, we could trick everyone into supporting basically any kind of hypothesis. So I wanted to give one test to see, at least in one case, whether what we measure from social media actually relates to the wider society. And I was waiting for many years until I could do this, and I did it as soon as I got tenured in Graz, because I could take the answer, whatever it was, without fear. And what we did is that we compared what we get in Twitter versus a representative survey in the UK. So first we pre-registered the design, so that we didn't have all those degrees of freedom of playing around with different methods. And what we did is that for a period of time, we got a lot of tweets from the United Kingdom. This is a combination of using Twitter and Crimson Hexagon, which has been recently renamed as Brandwatch. It's a reseller of Twitter data, so that you indirectly pay to Twitter through them. So it still works. It's not like the rest of the Twitter API, but it's thanks to kind of paying some money to access the data. And I wanted that. I mean, we always use the API, but this is especially useful because we can filter by country, and we can apply pretty accurate gender detection methods for English-speaking users. So that will allow us to get all of the tweets from the UK and to know who are men and who are women, because we also have reasonable suspicion that these text analysis methods perform differently for men and for women. So analyzing that, we applied the typical text method I told you earlier, look, but we also applied something more advanced, and I will show you a bit also after this how the text analysis works. And from that we could get a gender rescaled weekly index of emotional expression, meaning that for every week we have a number of how many people on Twitter express an emotion by recounting, there's more tweets by men than by women, that's why we need to rescale it. And we can do that for 3 emotions that map to the same as we have in a survey, that are sadness, fear or feeling scared, and joy or happiness. So the survey comes from YouGov. They have a representative panel in the United Kingdom where people are reporting whether they experienced or not a particular emotion out of a list of 12 in the last week. So with that we can reconstruct the previous week in terms of feelings in the UK, and then we can correlate with what we measure on Twitter to test if we measure something equivalent or similar to what we get from a survey. So I divided the analysis in 2 parts. There's a historical part with data that existed before I made the pre-registration. I did look a bit into a couple of months from it, but not everything. But I know that the value of a pre-registration is on a prediction. So then I predicted the analysis on future data that didn't exist yet. I waited for a while, and then after collecting the data, we tested in this kind of future sample we didn't have when pre-registering the analysis. So I have some examples of the results. This one is for sadness, one of the first of the emotions. In red, you have a rescaled time series of emotions on Twitter, and in blue, you have it on YouGov. Again, this is weekly. And the line here is separating the historical period with the prediction period. First of all, the correlation coefficients are rather similar, something like 0.6, 0.7 in both periods. And you can tell why. So, for example, here there's this spike in both. It's a little bit lagged, but more or less on average they are similar in the correlation. And this is because there was an election here pretty relevant for Twitter, for Brexit, that make some people pretty sad in the UK, and you could see that on Twitter and on the survey. Then this other spike here is basically the pandemic as it started, in particular the lockdowns that created quite a wave of sadness. Then it relaxed, went down, and sometimes we can learn things from systematic errors like this one here. This was sadness on Twitter that did not appear in the survey, and this was the George Ferguson events in the US that made people express sadness on Twitter but not report it in the survey. So this is kind of a shared sadness with the US, but not self-reported once they are being asked in a more private situation. So at least, I mean, this is of course distorting or affecting the correlation, but it's telling us already ideas on how we should filter the data in the future to make sure they talk about them and their country and not about foreign events. So yeah, then as usual, the things go better, but at least we have a correlation here also of a similar value. And in particular, this case of sadness was something that worked pretty similarly with this kind of word counting method and with a more advanced text analysis method. Also, yeah, I want to brief it later. So I was pretty confident that even for different methods, we can measure sadness. And this correlation coefficient here, I mean, when we talk about survey research, two concurrent surveys on the same question usually correlate weakly with something like 0.7. The best case is presidential election surveys in the US that are done on a weekly basis, and they don't correlate more than this week to week. So it is already something that doesn't necessarily have to be only error on the social media side, but is also at the level of error on the survey side too. And so another example is this one. This is for anxiety or feeling scared in both the survey and Twitter. You have red in Twitter and blue in YouGov. The correlation on the historical part is mainly driven by this spike here that was the beginning of the lockdowns in the UK. You could see both a lot of anxiety on Twitter and on the survey. And this, if we separate the metrics for men and women, this was basically women that were expressing more anxiety. And when looking at the tweets, you notice that it's mainly because of having to take care of children while working at home. So it was quite a clear case of being related to the lockdowns and not to the pandemic as a whole. So this creates quite a high correlation. If you take into account some rank correlation, is not that much. It's also like 0.65 as before. And then after that period, there's still some correlation, 0.5, but of course we don't have a lot of variation. So this is telling us that we can measure things that happen, like for example, the terrorist attacks. There's a big oscillation and we can measure it. But if we really want to track small changes over periods of time, maybe this methodology is not that good, because here again, there was little variation, and of course the correlation is weaker, about 0.5. In particular, yeah, here if we ignore gender in the analysis, the correlations are weaker. So it's telling us that when we do something like analyzing emotions, we should consider gender if we want to be representative for the rest of the population. And another example I have, yeah, is for the positive emotions. That's the third we have. And this one was interesting. So the dictionary-based method, look, was terrible. Correlations were basically zero or not significant in both periods. I'm not even reporting them here because you will see like just noise. But for the more advanced text analysis method, they were better. Again, about 0.5, 0.6 as before. And this is something we were suspecting on these word counting methods, that if you just count positive words on social media, they don't mean anything. You need a more advanced model to see what is real positivity and not just nice words. And what we get, yeah, is correlations like you see here. There's a typical spike that is predictable, no? Is the January 1st or related to Christmas. But then we have these dips here, like again, the beginning of the pandemic or the George Ferguson events. And again, it generalizes with something like 0.5, 0.6. So at least comparing to survey methodology, social media data, for the case of emotions over time, is not that different. Whether you can then use it for comparing regions for emotions or for other things like opinions, we have reasonable doubts. But at least for emotions over time, we're getting something that is comparable to what surveys say against each other when they exist. We replicated this also in Austria. In particular, a newspaper, The Standard, was running a survey on its readers for 3 weeks, and we learned about that a few days before the survey was over, and we contacted The Standard because we had all of the comments that people leave on the news pieces. because we had an observatory of emotions in Austria. So we could compare what we see in the standard with what people reply on in the survey. The survey was only for readers of the standard, so if you read an article, you could say whether you felt positive or negative over the last day. And we really didn't have time to even pre-register the study, because we learned it like here, and then we wanted to publish it in the Sunday version of the standard just 3 days later. So we just did the analysis with what we had and sent it there. They published it in the standard, and it looked basically like this. This is a 3-day rolling window, because when you ask people about yesterday, there's some imprecision in that question. If you answer the questionnaire at 1 a.m., yesterday is not 1 hour ago, it's a few, at least 25 hours ago, so there's some nuance. But if we have this 3-day rolling window and you run the typical same text analysis methods versus what people say in the survey, we get a correlation of like 0.9. And actually, if we take changes between days and then we calculate the same correlation, we get something like 0.7. So here we're measuring the emotions on the same people that write the text, and we get this strong correlation. It's not representative of the society, but it's representative of that community. So we're even getting a bit more confident that if we measure something at the daily level, if we have the validation like data like this, we can identify relatively strong oscillations of dips of emotions or peaks. Here, I think it was a very nice weekend and some news about the vaccines, so people react to their environment, and this appears both in a survey and on the text of social media. So in particular, I think there's a wider pattern happening here in these kind of studies, and is that we are not measuring the emotions of the people we see online. We measure the emotions also of other people around them, because they don't really talk necessarily about what they feel, but also about things that make other people feel things. So social media users might be social sensors of the rest of the society, and in the end, the emotions we measure are of a larger population than just those people we have on social media. And when I thought about this, I asked a colleague of mine, Mirta Galesic, that is an expert in social sensing, and she threw a few hypotheses at me to test on the data. For example, when people express emotions, do they use third-person pronouns? When you take people with a lot of followers or followings, are they better predictors? And the hypotheses she sent to me were starting to make sense in the data. The data was not rejecting them. So perhaps thinking, social media is not representative is not necessarily the problem, because it might be measuring other people, and the question of how to know who is being measured and so on, that's another problem. But at least sometimes we think about social media as a closed system, and we measure things in it, but it might be giving us information also from outside the sample of people in social media, and we still don't know how to measure and verify this, but it's an explanation for how surprisingly good the methods are working. And that's a take-home message. So from this, I think there's important concerns about these kind of macroscopes in the sense of who are we measuring, what are we measuring. But with this kind of established comparison with sociological methodologies, we're getting something comparable. So one of the things that kept me awake at night is like, oh, am I measuring society or just some Twitter people? No, I can sleep a little bit better because at least I have a number. It's not 0, it's not 1, it's 0.66. So it is something that I can now count into further statistical analysis, correct for error measurement, and then have a more robust approach that includes these kind of error issues in our further analysis. If you want to know more about it, there's the first paper about the Austrian replication that we did later, my eternal preprint where I report the results, but you have the data if you want to check them. And then we wrote a chapter for the World Happiness Report last year, summarizing this more for practitioners. And that's an easier read if you don't want to go into the statistics. And last, if I have a bit of time, I just want to show our very latest method that goes into trying to identify individual emotions of the person writing a piece of text. Because with this thing like look or whatnot, we measure just prevalence of positive and negative words, and it might tell us something about a lot of tweets on average, but very little about each particular tweet. We wanted to work on something that can tell us something about the person writing a piece of text. And this is something I also wanted to do for a while, but it was always hard because I didn't have the data. In particular, all sentiment analysis and all the methods I apply, they have an assumption, and is that the people who read a piece of text are able to tell you about the feelings of the people who wrote the text. In general, you take, you have someone writing a tweet like this one here, and then you put it on Mechanical Turk, and there's someone else who you pay a fraction of a cent to annotate a tweet, and then they tell you what they think, if they are honest and not a bot, and so on. They tell you what they think the tweet means, and then this is what we use as training data and as validation data for the text analysis methods that we apply. So the ground truth is not the real truth, because we're estimating it, and we need to have something that tells us the emotions of the person writing, so that then we can train models against that and then have a more valid measurement of what people feel online, rather than what a mechanical Turker will say about what that person feels. So it took a while, but then the perfect data set came along. It's from a platform called Vent, where people, especially on mobile phones, can express what they feel. They usually seek emotional connection with other people about an emotional experience. And they write there what they feel, and then they annotate, like you label what you feel with a mood label that says something like I'm angry, I'm sad, I'm happy, and so on. So we have those annotations by the people who write the posts on this platform. So from Vent we have several million posts, because they can be seen publicly and crawled. They also redistribute data for research. And with that we can train a model that has seen many, many examples of emotional expressions online. And the way we do it is outlined here. So we have the typical large language model trained with Twitter data, BearTweet in particular, which is, it looks like this. You have like these transformer layers of neural networks, and they have a lot of parameters, but we can use them in a validation scenario with new text to see if they have generalized well or not. So what we do is that we train a model that we call Leia, linguistic embeddings for the identification of affect, and is another Star Wars pun, because there was Luke from Luke Skywalker, then the latest one is called Vader from Darth Vader, and we have the best one that we hope takes up based on linguistic embeddings. And basically we train a model with these kind of annotations, and the cool thing is that we have so much data that we can have several test data sets. For example, we have the typical random set of posts we save for evaluation, for test, but we also take a random sample of 10% of the users, and we take all of their posts out, so the model hasn't seen a single message from those users in the training data to see if it generalizes across people. And we also take the last 10% of time, so that we don't have any of those tweets from that period in the training data, so we can test how the model generalizes over time. We also have the typical out-of-domain datasets, so annotations of emotions from other media, like Twitter or Reddit, but these are annotated by mechanical Turkers, so this is just something to check and not a real validation. So in the end we have a model and we compare with some baselines, but it can tell us an estimation of whether a piece of text from social media contains either sadness, fear, anger. Then we have joy as a positive emotion, as affection, as a type of socially oriented positive emotion that is pretty frequent on social media. So we evaluated Leia on this. The size of the datasets is here. So as you see, we have several million for the training data, including those 5 emotions. This is the natural distribution of them, so this is not balanced. And then we have the typical development set to test some of the assumptions, but we evaluate on these 3 tests, plus the leave-out samples, or the out-of-domain validation datasets that, again, is this from media that the model has never seen. And the results look more or less like this. Yeah, we have the typical look word counting method in blue, and this is for the temporal, the random, and the user set. This is F1, so 100% will be the best, and 0 will be a terrible classifier. So look is not very good. In particular, it cannot predict affection at all, but even if you evaluate with the others, it's pretty bad. If you train yourself a supervised model, it's okay-ish, but then Leia outperforms both baselines substantially, not only there, but also in the other cases like temporal and random, with some F1 between 70% and 80% in all emotions. And then when going to the out-of-domain situation, also Leia is doing better than the other methods. For example, I think the benchmark, the real one in psychology, is called ICR. And these are texts produced from a special experiment in which you ask people to write something about a situation when they felt anger or when they felt happiness. So they really write a very close, emotional, very well measured kind of text, but also very rare. It's not something you write every day on social media. And in that case, Luke is pretty bad. That's 13% of F1 on average. A supervised model is a bit better, like 55, but Leia does the small version we have with a few parameters, that's 70%, and the large one, that's almost 80%. This is almost as human performance in that task. Humans have about 80% when trying to estimate the emotions of someone in ICR. So we just made a small experiment with the students in my course here, and we gave them some bent posts to classify and compared with Leia. So they guessed themselves, and then we compared with our model. And out of 14 students in the seminar, only 2 managed to outperform Leia. So the task of bent is harder than ICR. And at least I think we're getting closer to that particular case, doing at least as good as well as a human. So if you want, you can play with it. It's on Hugging Face already. You can apply it, but also if you go there, there's a web interface for you to try messages that it might not manage to pick and try to outperform the model yourself. And of course, we already published the preprint. It's already posted, so you can check it out and use it already if you want. And that was it for today. I just wanted to first motivate how I study collective emotions, then how I'm validating the methods we apply, in particular to verify what we measure online on this macro level behavior versus a survey that is the standard in social sciences. And now we're trying to go into having a good measurement at the individual level, not necessarily to intervene on individuals, but at least to have as good as possible a measurement we can generalize to the rest of the society, and especially to know the emotions of people. So if you want to know more, you can check my website, thegarcia.eu, or follow me on Twitter. And I hope that there's time for discussion. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Thanks, David, for the wonderful talk. And we have time for questions. Who wants to go first? Yeah.
Thanks very much. This is such a wonderful fit for the cluster. It's great to see that you're here now.
Thank you.
I have a question about YouGov. I had a meeting with Stefan Shakespeare about a month ago, and I'm going to meet him again in person in a couple of weeks. He's extremely excited about collective behavior, and he's very keen to work with us. So he's the CEO of YouGov, for those who don't know. And he's very keen to work with us. And what he was promoting to me was things that kind of scared me. 2 things that were very important but kind of scared me. One is that unlike other data sets, they have longitudinal data. They have a very high retention rate of hundreds of thousands of people over many years, which according to him is very unique, because often you get these snapshots. This relates to what you said at the end. You know, can you look at the individual within the collective or just at the general collective patterns? And there the individuality seemed to be possible. That's scary-ish. And then what was even more scary was how much other data that they also have regarding people, regarding their buying habits and lots of other things. And so I'm not sure about the ethics of such collaboration. He assured me that they have all of the ethical things sorted, but I'll wait till I speak to him. But what is your perspective? Is this something that we should sort of discuss with him to see if there's a meaningful way to work with these incredible cohorts of hundreds of thousands of people over a very long time series? Or would you say, run away, this is going to get us all into trouble?
Okay, great question, thanks. So yeah, the data I used is from a subset of the panel. It's about 1,000 respondents only every week that answer it. And it's not, you cannot track them, so it only gives you an estimate based on those 1,000. Whether they are the same 1,000 or not, we don't know. We know that their composition is matching. They don't have to post-stratify, so they are already stratified, so that you just can count things over them. But whether they are the same or not, we don't know. We suspect it's not, because it's much cheaper to do it if you don't track people. But there could be quite some overlap. So first of all, in what we do, I don't think it is. But the question of whether it is interesting or not, okay, let me tell you. In this case, for me, depends a lot on the dimensionality of the trace. So if it is a question like emotions, that you have like a list of 12, even if you get this longitudinal time series, it's going to be very hard to de-anonymize that person, even if you use a lot of other data, because it's just 5 dimensions over time. So you cannot really infer who they are without actually working at YouGov. But once they give you more high-dimensional data, like interests or locations, or you just need a few hundred dimensions for one of these list of traces to become individually identifiable. And then if you are able to use some other data that, for example, can find if these people have been in a particular place, and you have just 3-4 locations, then you're able to identify them from the data set. So in terms of whether it is anonymous or not, I think dimensionality plays a role. And if it is something as simple as just a few opinions or an emotion, is okay. But when you go into something like purchase data, location data, call data from phone companies, that is tricky. And I think the participants have to be very well informed whether this is anonymous or not, and calling anonymous something that has such high resolution, I think is dishonest. We have to tell them you could be identified from this kind of data, first of all. Second, I guess, so a company is trying to sell you this data, so for them it will always be ethical, but we can ask other people whether we think it's ethical or not, and having an ethics commission with a set of people from different disciplines or even outside the university is the best. Or at least is one way to start thinking about ethics without jumping too fast into studies. I mean, here in Konstanz we have an ethics commission, but it's mainly for biological studies or medicine and so on. And my feeling is that when I send them a design like these kind of annotations and so on, they see it innocuous enough to give me an exemption. But if I send them something slightly trickier like that, I have data that could identify people, then they will not like to make a statement. So I think at least here in Konstanz, I haven't figured out if we have a solution for ethically complicated human behavior studies or social science studies. I think right now, I think I will have to go to an external agency and pay a lot of money to get that reviewed. So I hope if you need anyone to jump on a ship on trying to make another ethics commission for human behavior non-medical studies, I'm happy to help as much as I can, because there is scrutiny on this. I know that we might not be forced by the university or legally to do that, but the journals and people want to see that we did some due process before doing this kind of studies. So I do feel compelled to try to do that, not just annoyed. I know it can be annoying or more depending on the commission, but I want to try. So someday I might come very grumpy saying I tried to do this study and the commission didn't want to review it. I'm afraid of that, and I think we might need a solution here. But that's just a process, not the answer to whether it's ethical or not. And I think, again, depending on the dimensionality and the research question and the sources, it might be. But a main problem for me, for example, with my social media data is that, for example, and that's my complex privacy topic, you can make inferences on people that are not in the data set, that are not in the sample. For example, when you have contact lists and you can see contacts to people outside social media, then you might see a person in several hundreds of other people and find, if you have just a phone number that they share, the list, you can make inferences on people who are not in the sample because you see their friends, and things like political orientation or sexual orientation can be inferred. So I think it's more complicated than what a commission can tell you. And I'm very happy to discuss those things if you have precise cases, but just like blanket solutions, it's like, you give us data, that's wonderful. Usually is risky. I will do it case by case, especially on the dimensions for anonymity. Yeah.
Thanks. So it was a really great talk. So I was wondering, I had the question for the slide 13.
Oh, okay. 13. Okay, let's go back to that. That's cool. I'm glad the numbers work.
So you mentioned before the date that there was no difference between high emotional and low emotional synchronization.
So so the high emotional is people who have a difference before and after the attacks.
Yeah. And
the low emotional, they don't have a difference, or they're even lower.
Yeah. But just before, it seems like the low emotional are slightly above.
No, and then this is not emotions, this is social process terms.
Okay.
So they're separated by emotions, but this is another behavior that is talking about people. And there's slightly above, this is a bit of the self-selection into the collective emotion. So people who were high in social process terms, I mean, they went down, but they kind of self-selected less into a collective emotion. Then in the statistics I made at the individual level, I kind of correct for these differences, but there's only so many things you can measure. So there could be other confounders, but at least the ones I could measure, I took them into account.
Okay.
But it's funny that there's a bit of a difference, and in the others there's also some differences, but these are just because there might be something else that is making them change. Then it's after the shock that makes some sense, but what made them difference there is some kind of self-selection process.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
First of all, thank you for the great talk. It's really interesting to see something, especially when you're from a completely different topic. But so it seems that Twitter is kind of important for your work. And so first of all, my first question would actually be, why did you choose Twitter? Is there any difference between for example, Facebook, or just looking at the comments underneath of a news article or something like this? And my second question would be, did you notice any differences in the data quality and, for example, emotional baseline after Musk bought Twitter?
Okay.
Because there were a lot of I myself don't use Twitter, but I just heard there were a lot of bans lifted and stuff like this, and I assume they could change the overall emotional baseline you have.
Yeah, good questions. So first, using Twitter is something we would like not to do since a while ago. The main reason is because everybody is using Twitter, and we have a bit of a model organism problem that we don't know if what we say is about people or about Twitter users. So there's always some added value on doing research on anything that is not Twitter. Basically, the triad was Twitter, Wikipedia, and Reddit is what everybody was using. And out of those, basically, Wikipedia is the surviving one in terms of easy access now. So anything that was not of those three platforms had a bonus for not being a model organism. So the reason why I used it for the Paris case is because that was a very openly available data source that people could replicate the study with, and it was a new thing in psychology that also everybody could just check the same thing. But it's true that now, first of all, it's harder. So using the API as I was using it back then is not possible. It might be if you pay through a company like Brandwatch, and I still have a contract with them, but let's see if I update it or not, depending on what can they give me in the future. So if you pay a bit of money, you can access some data, but the same level is not really possible anymore. That's why we try things like the standard in Austria. We have all of those comments. Vent as an example. We also have all the Reddit archive until recently. So there's platforms that are becoming a bit more open. For example, Facebook has an academic API for scientists that is in beta testing in the US. But through CrowdTangle, that is what they have for journalists, you can get a lot of data as an academic. But when you want to do something like this, give me random posts from country X, is not for that. It will give you posts from a community or a group, and not like on Twitter that you can just get access to everything. However, okay, more on that before going into the change in Twitter, is that the Digital Services Act, which is basically a new regulation in in Europe, is enabling us to request access to data. And companies as large as Twitter should be, or must by law, provide a way for us to request data for research that is in the public good. So I think it's so clear that they will start setting up some other ways for academics to access data. Let's see what. But in principle, they cannot run away from this if they want to keep on operating in Europe. Maybe they also stop operating in Europe, but at least if they want to still keep on making money from Europe, they have to collaborate to a certain extent. And then on Twitter's change, since Musk took over, we know that there's been an increase in toxicity, for example, and in some bot-like behavior, paradoxically. But that's what I've seen of research doing a before and after. On emotions, I haven't seen any publicly available research, and in our own text analysis, we haven't seen much. And if it happens, it's lower. So we haven't seen a clear jumps after we clean for bot-like behavior and so on. So at least, I don't know, we haven't corrected it formally yet because we haven't updated the analysis, but at least just eyeballing the plots, if I remember them now, I haven't seen a change in baseline right now, only in toxicity, but we remove that kind of content. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other question?
Yeah, hi David, great talk. I just was wondering about some emotion that might not necessarily lie on a positive negative spectrum, more like irony or satire, which feels like something that a lot of more young people, Gen Z, would be using a lot to communicate about political opinions. Have you gone around that? Have you found a way to look at that?
Yes. So, I mean, we don't have this in these studies yet, but luckily Reddit actually is a very good source for that, because there's quite a norm that you write /s when you're being sarcastic, and there's huge data sets of self-annotated sarcasm that we can compare with a non-self-annotated as negative sampling. I mean, we're not sure that the other ones were not sarcastic, but we're very sure these ones are. And at least thanks to Reddit data, we have some interesting sarcasm detectors, especially for political discussions where it was a problem. The reason why we haven't corrected for that in the past or removed it is because when we ask annotators to annotate if something is sarcastic or not, they were pretty bad. So not only in the sense of whether, we didn't have many cases where we knew whether the person was sarcastic or not, but also agreement between annotators when you don't have the ground truth was terrible. So we didn't, it was a problem, but we didn't have any way to solve it. But now with this Reddit data, we're doing better. We still want to validate that with Twitter, if we still use it. But right now, first of all, we saw that the prevalence of things that would look sarcastic based on that data set is super low. Not in political discussions, that's true, but in general, at least in English, it was much lower than we expected. And at some point, I will be able to come here and say, like, without sarcasm. But my impression right now from the prevalence we see is that it's so little that it's not going to bias the statistics much. Yeah. But it's happening. So if you have a student, I want to look for a second student to work on this, to adapt it to Twitter in particular, where we don't have a method. Yeah.
Jens?
No?
Yeah.
Test me. Great talk, thanks.
Hey.
I was just thinking there's so much more emotions expressed through other systems like paraverbal, prosodia, but also in the visual field. So this is totally out of the blue, but have you thought about, or maybe do you know of attempts to derive emotions from other media means and types, like pictures, or when people leave text messages and there's emotionality, prosody in their voice, which is probably also containing a lot of information.
No, of course. So I think if this was verbal communication, extracting the emotions from just a transcript will be too noisy compared to the actual expression, because you're missing the prosody. Given that it's only textual, then the prosody is missing, which becomes error in the communication. But at least we have what is said there and nothing else. There was no other channel of communication. However, yes, there is work on multimodal sentiment analysis. Not that much for identifying emotions, but for identifying just valence, like positive or negative or neutral. Actually, like a decade ago, I participated on a survey on multimodal emotion detection and sentiment analysis, and how this was really isolated in different channels. So you will have to combine them into an actual estimate that improves individual estimates. And something that really combines different modalities is something that I really haven't seen yet, because it's really contingent on the particular situation. So for Twitter, mostly will be the text and the images, if you use any. But as soon as you go to TikTok or Instagram, then you need a completely different methodology. So I think that need for flexibility is what has hindered that kind of combination to get something better than just one channel. In my case here, there's a lot of depth in that topic. So for example, in terms of facial expression of emotions is also something we usually worry about. And at least the automatic methods we know are pretty bad. In a sense, I mean, identifying positivity or negativity, maybe, but if you go anything more nuanced, they do worse than a typical fax coder that has been trained to identify smaller expressions. And I think it's because the most overt signal of positivity, at least when you have American participants, is they're smiling all the time, and it's impossible to know what they feel from facial expression. So I think if we go to other cultures, it might be better, but at least the typical study with American college students, they're just too nice, so to speak, to the camera. That one, but another one is that there's some emotions that are, especially facial emotions, that are socially encoded, like being surprised is one that when you have people around, people raise their eyebrows, and when you have them in an experiment, they don't, because you don't have a surprise to show to anyone else. And this creates a lot of inconsistency that paradoxically in language, even though it's much more dimensional, it's always social, while facial expression doesn't have to be. Only when you are like in a diary, might not be not social text, but thanks to that it's always social, I think it's reducing that problematic of faces. But that being said, yeah, when you talk about an individual, basically you want voice, face, and text or content. And here, given that people are neither showing their face nor using their voice, we just analyze what is there, and then we are going to be as bad as anybody else with the text. But it's true that in terms of fundamental error, if we want to make statements like the collective emotions, we need to correct it. And right now with this 0.7, 0.8 F1, with a sample of about 10,000 or so per day, it's okay. You know, you can see effects. Yeah, but if it is too small, not really. But when you have like something like a cascade, it's visible, like in France. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions? Do we have anything in the chat? I think no. So, well, thank you all for joining today. Thanks a lot to David for the great talk, and see you all next week again. Thank you.
Bye.